All right, so we will start with introductions, just a brief intro of yourself, your role, and relevant experience, bearing in mind the topic we're discovering. And so in no particular order, the rectangle below me, Justin, if you don't mind going first.
Okay, well, so I'm Justin. I'm the, I guess I'm the market general manager for Nespresso in Hong Kong and Macau. I've been in Nespresso for 5 years, and I actually started at Nespresso as the regional APAC person running the B2B business in Nespresso. So I think, the topics that we're talking today has been quite relevant to me for quite some time. B2B Results has been part of my life for the last 5 years, and I think I guess marketing for B2B in general has been a unique challenge for us because we are mostly a consumer-focused company, but B2B is also a significant part of our business. And I think for us, the challenge is really about how do we manage the different mindsets to a different audience that's required for B2B. And I think certainly with PR, we've recently had some interesting experience with Hoffman and also with a few other partners. And there's certainly things that I'd be happy to share in this conversation.
Great, thank you, Justin. And I'm sure we will get into some of those things, no doubt. Sheel, if we go clockwise, you are next, please.
Hi, I'm Sheel Kohli. I am currently the Chief Marketing Officer of Eqonex Group, although I'll be leaving the company pretty soon, actually. But I'm currently there, and Eqonex Group is the first NASDAQ-listed cryptocurrency group. So we have a range of businesses, from an exchange to a custody business to an asset management business. And so we do a lot of B2B and B2C marketing as well. My background prior to that was a number of other fintech companies, but really the base of my expertise has been 18 years in banking and insurance, finance. There I've done a lot of B2B communications in particular, and have had a lot of experience across Asia, but also into Europe as well, running pretty comprehensive, integrated B2B marketing and communication strategies. So yeah, this is a very fascinating subject because it's moving very, very quickly. B2C is exciting, but B2B I think is sometimes overlooked because B2C is often seen as quite sexy, but B2B is really quite exciting, and the challenges are much greater in many ways. So it's going to be a very interesting discussion today.
I think so, unfairly overlooked, I think, often. David, over to you.
Hi, David Hardoon. I'm the Managing Director of Aboitiz Data Innovation. And essentially, Aboitiz Data Innovation is part of the Aboitiz conglomerate, which covers areas of power, the generation distribution, food, agri, finances, construction, and so forth. So Aboitiz Data Innovation is really focused in terms of how to bring together the different dimensions and the possibilities from a data point of view. As you can imagine, we're looking at a B2B, B2B2C, B2C type of endeavor. So it's really kind of focusing on bringing further opportunities for the Aboitiz businesses, as well as our partners and potential clients out there. I'll keep it short and succinct.
Thank you, David. Marty, you're next.
Hi, I am Marty Filipowski. I work for Nutanix, based in Sydney, Australia. Nutanix is involved in cloud computing. We have a hybrid multi-cloud platform that enables enterprises and government organizations to do hybrid multi-cloud type computing. I have been in Sydney for 17 years and had a mix of roles covering Australia and the whole of APJ. Prior to landing in Sydney, I worked in the US and worked as a political press secretary in the US Senate and in some other roles in healthcare and telecom. So, but at the moment, the role that I'm in is primarily B2B, and the discussion today and the learnings that we'll gain from others, I think will be very fascinating.
Yeah, I hope so. Thanks, Marty. And last but by no means least, Caroline, representing the agency side.
Yeah, hi. So I'm Caroline. I run APAC for Hoffman Agency. I've spent over 25 years in the tech industry. So this is, really a sweet spot for us. Definitely, whether it's, prior to being at Hoffman, I've also spent 15 years in-house in the roles that we're talking about. So whether it is in terms of communications roles like at Google, or say CMO at Appier, AI unicorn and startup, IPO this year, we're just in all of the roles. I would say that we're really seeing a big shift right now in the B2B and tech company space. Particularly, I think for a comms agency like ours, we're seeing the shift toward clients wanting to solve business problems, and I think that's an interesting angle to possibly explore today.
Yeah, indeed, and we will explore. So I will get this going by asking some questions, but please don't wait for me necessarily to call on you. If you want to jump in, respond to a point someone else has made, please feel free to do that. That way we can turn this into more of a conversation than a round robin. But to get things going, I'm very happy to prompt with some questions. And the first one, I think, which is probably quite a basic one, but it's a good place to start, is what role does public relations play in your B2B marketing strategy? How has it changed, and how is it changing? And again, Justin, because you're directly below me, I hope you don't mind. I'm gonna come to you first again, please.
Sure, no worries. So we sell coffee. So that's our business. And I think for the longest time, we feel that B2B marketing is really about getting B2B decision makers to drink our coffee. Now, that I think has worked for a very long time, but I think we've seen certainly in the last couple of years that we need to start doing things a bit differently, because as the coffee cultures in all the markets that we operate in evolves, just getting people to come to an event to drink some coffee is no longer the way it's no longer as relevant as it should be. So I think certainly in the markets that I've looked after, I think we've really had a bit of a change of approach probably in the last 2 years or so, where I think we spend a lot more focus on the PR side of things, because we feel that the story that we bring to the table is not just about Nespresso serving the best coffee, sustainability. So we can't just take all of the B2C messages and then put it in a B2B context and expect that our customer will resonate around that. If I look at our B2B portfolio, I mean, our two biggest groups of customers are hospitality and offices. And I think with offices, we recently did an event where we were really talking about the future of work. So what we've come to realize is that I think the role that PR needs to play for us is that PR shapes the conversation. It takes us away from just being the people who comes to your pantry to stock up your coffee, but it puts us in a position where we can contribute to conversations around what's relevant to our B2B, especially the office decision makers. I would say that we're still working on refining that, especially in the Asian cultural context. I think for some of our markets in Europe, they've been doing it for longer. Nespresso has been there for longer. So that's a different conversation that they have there. But I think here we're really trying to use PR to inject ourselves into a conversation that's relevant to the local decision makers, so that we can both be part of the conversation and also put a few coffee machines in the pantries.
Yeah, it's a really good point, actually, on not just relying on B2C messaging, I think, which is actually one that sometimes I think is overlooked. And also, of course, the importance of relevance. And that's something that public relations can and should hopefully provide. Sheel, what's your take?
Yeah, I think that in all the industries and all the companies I've worked in, PR is the knowledge base. So, and when you think about what you're trying to achieve with B2B, which as Justin said, in his case, he wants more businesses to buy and stock his coffee. You know, in my businesses, I've wanted people to buy our product, whatever that is, right? And what the first question people ask is, in a B2B context is not the price, which is it might be the question in a B2C context, but more, what does it mean? How does it help me? Give me more information, give me more detail. And PR is actually the knowledge base, is actually the foundation from which you can provide all those answers and build activities and events to actually demonstrate the strength of your knowledge, because that then wins you trust, it gives you endorsement, and then you get much greater, longer term affinity with the clients and the customers that you're targeting. The other thing about PR is that it's the key to third-party endorsement, so media relations and media coverage. And I was a journalist for 10 years before I even got into this business, and so I suppose I'm particularly sensitive to the media. And although media is less important than it used to be, there's still great sensitivity among certain stakeholders to what they see is in terms of paid media versus earned media. And PR is vital for providing that much greater credibility to your brand and your reputation through earned media. I think an earned article that provides independent endorsement is 10 times more valuable to certain stakeholders than something that's paid or sponsored. And I think that PR still plays a very, very important role in terms of driving that earned media. But as I say, it's not just earned media, it's the whole thought leadership base, the whole knowledge base that it could provide. Yeah. And I think that is how I see PR really informing our B2B marketing strategy.
Yeah, very good points there in terms of trust, third-party endorsement, and the knowledge base, I guess, in terms of helping customers solve problems. David, you both managed to move in the order, but you've also got your hand up, so I'm going to come to you next, please.
No, thanks. I didn't mean to interject, but I was just really thinking about what Sheel was sharing, and I just wanted to build on that in terms of the knowledge component. Now, the space that I'm in is data, and as you can imagine, there is a lot of PR media, both paid, unpaid, attention on it. But in fact, this is where I believe the criticality of PR really stands out in the space of data, because there is a tremendous amount of noise. In fact, I still joke that if you go ask 10 people what is data, you'll get about 15 different answers. So it is how to really create that refined lens of the value, the necessity, the context within whatever offering or whatever engagement the business has, be it in terms of a selling point of view or really in terms of a clarity perspective. Because if you don't understand what I'm doing, if there's no clarity, there is no point even trying to sell, essentially. So I just wanted to build on that. And just to share one more thing that I actually tell my own folks is the other dimension is if we don't talk about things, if we don't have the ability to echo the value proposition, the benefit of the work, it's as if you've never done it. And given that we're kind of this slightly unique situation whereby I'm doing things internally, but at the same time, everything I'm doing is for an external audience, PR has that, like I said, criticality within it. You know, I'm helping that refinement and that essentially ultimately that position in a sea of noise to a certain degree.
Yeah, and that whole point about the sea of noise is, I think, one we can definitely expand on. Unfortunately, I guess the risk is that a lot of PR contributes to the sea of noise, right? So it's almost, it's how do you ensure yours doesn't, and that perhaps is where the secret is. Marty, how is the role of PR changing in terms of how you look at your B2B marketing?
Yeah. Well, as I said earlier, Nutanix is into cloud computing, so our role is to help decision makers and IT decision makers and chief executive officers see the value that we can bring when they are making purchasing decisions about IT and cloud. the first thing that we have to make sure PR does is to participate in decisions about the strategy of the company, you know, and to have a seat at the table. So, you know, in my role at the regional level, we're quite integrated with the marketing team and the sales team and other teams, our chief technical officer, you know, when discussions about strategy and planning are happening. And we also, as part of those discussions, participate in discussions about the messaging. We need to make sure the messaging is relevant to local markets. Yes, we have global messages that we're aligning to and business priorities that we're aligning to. But if they don't tap into local conversations, the problems that organizations are trying to solve on the local level, I think we will lose people's attention. And to that end, you know, we're trying to make sure that we are demonstrating how we're helping our customers and potential customers solve problems. So the messaging that we need to go forward with is very outcome focused. It's not about, you know, it's not, yes, we're talking about our products and services at some point, but the conversation about the problems we're solving becomes more important. And so we look to include those messages in most everything we do.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think one of the things that contributes to the noise that David mentioned is actually too much of a focus on products and features rather than on solving, you know, customer problems. Some really great points there from all of you, I think. So Caroline, I'll come to you for your insight in terms of what you see across all of your clients. And also, I guess, maybe I can just summarize in terms of what each of the panelists has said so far. So we have Justin, who mentioned how PR can shape the conversation, provide that relevance. Sheel noted it's really kind of the knowledge base that drives thought leadership, trust, third-party endorsement. For David, it kind of creates that refined lens amid a lot of noise. And Marty mentioned how important it is for public relations to be at the table when it comes to strategy, and also developing relevant messaging that is both relevant locally and outcome focused. So that's a lot, Caroline. I don't expect you to go through all of that, but just from your perspective, in terms of everything you're seeing, how are you seeing the role of PR changing, if at all?
Yeah. I mean, I think, first of all, right, you know, there's a lot of terminology out there. I think we need to start by, you know, discussing, well, define what you mean by PR. Because for different clients, it actually means different things. And I think, you know, that's what we try to do in the initial conversation with clients on this. Also, another thing is definitely, you know, even when we're talking about problems, right, we also have to look at, is it really a PR problem or is it a business problem? And I think some of that came across with the other panelists, right? It's important to make that distinction almost and have that conversation. And also, I think, you know, long term, I think PR can be a tool to help the business, to solve the business problem. But to Marty's point, we need to see at the table, you know, with not just the PR people, but also the sales representative, the product people, also the marketing folks and whatnot. And for us at the agency side, it really is trying to work out what is the right combination of tools, pull together to kind of solve that problem. And I think that's important. One other thing I would say is that, you know, when looking at an integrated approach, right, PR is also important in terms of defining that overarching narrative. So, you know, that is really important, and it is looking at that mix and match. And, you know, research has shown, I was just reading something off kind of the B2B Institute at LinkedIn. And I learned that, you know, the research showed that B2B brands, they grow. For them to grow, it really requires a balance of short-term sales activation and long-term brand building. And how I look at it is, you know, short-term sales activation maybe is more marketing, digital, whatnot, whereas PR comes to play when we're talking about the long-term. So I know it's not a short answer, but, you know, it's a lot of defining, you know, when we're starting that conversation, and then really pinpointing what's the starting point of all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Really, yeah, very, a very, very good summary actually there in terms of some of the challenges I think facing PR practitioners in the B2B space. So the definition in terms of what exactly is it they're being called on to do? Are we talking about PR problems versus business problems? And of course, the importance of having a seat at the table and a long-term focus. So does anyone else want to respond to anything that was said during that discussion? Before I move on to another question, please feel free to. If not, I'm quite happy to take the conversation into our next question.
I perhaps just very briefly, I think from your point, and I mean, it's in hindsight, everything is obvious, but I think it's a good calling out in terms of a long-term strategy versus a more sales objective, and essentially how these have different treatments and different approach in terms of objective, in terms of and in terms of how to leverage it from a PR point of view. I think that's a very, very good call out, because I think from at least how I, and from I mentioned earlier, how I look at PR, to me it's a much longer term narrative where it's and also Arun, to your point, is how do we not contribute to the noise, but actually help in a broader sense the noise to a certain degree. Now, obviously that will have a derivative of a sales benefit as part of B2B, but almost it's like a nice outcome rather than a upfront objective. So just to comment on that aspect.
Yeah, and yes, and the other thing too, the more we listen and the more time we take to listen about what's going on externally and listening to the objectives that the business wants to achieve, you know, when we're doing our jobs on an internal basis with our stakeholders and participating in the conversations, the better job we do of listening, the better job we are going to do at delivering messaging that cuts through.
And Arun, I'm sorry, I'm going to add on to that. I think what also makes it quite difficult, you know, having worked in-house also, is really, you know, people in different roles on our client side have different agendas or different goals, right? So what that means is, you know, what a comms lead would be focused on versus what a marketing, you know, CMO role versus, you know, what a business role, you know, the focus would be really different. And I think that is a hard balance. And a lot of times, you know, as an agency, you know, in order to make all of this work, to Marty's point, is bring everyone to the table and kind of co-creating this. And also from an agency point of view, it's us having to play the role of kind of being the glue and kind of trying to sort out what makes sense, what's the agenda and objective for the sales teams versus the comms team and the marketing teams whom we often work with, right? And so, you know, it's easy to just talk like this, but we know in real life, when you're putting things into practice, we're often working across different teams, different, you know, executive buy-ins and whatnot. And so it's not an easy problem to solve there.
So I'll come to the integration discussion in a little bit. Before that, just to stay on this, a couple of the points that are being kind of focused on here. One is the idea of PR helping in terms of a long-term focus versus perhaps short-term sales. And the second is being able to break through, I think, given the relentless rise in noise of B2B content. So Justin and Sheel, your thoughts on those 2 points would be welcome.
Yeah, I think, sorry.
Go ahead, Justin.
Okay, thanks. So Arun, I think on the point about I think looking at long-term and the short-term, my sense is that the most effective PR tends to be the one where you can pick a topic that is that is topical, but at the same time, it's also got legs for you to build on. I think if I look at some of our experience in the B2C world, especially around sustainability, the best PR that we do around this is really things that we not only are topical, but we can actually take that and then every year evolve it, but stay on the same sort of topic so that we can develop thought leadership around that. For B2B, I feel that this is probably even more important because I think in the consumer space, there are always things that you can do to mean, in terms of the amount of media that you buy or the kind of execution that you do to really spice up the message. But for B2B, I think the messaging side needs to be a lot stronger. And I think the consistency becomes more important because, I mean, B2B decision makers, there's so many messages, so many people trying to market to them to sell something. To be the one person who comes, you know that what sort of topic they want to talk to you about, and as long as it's something that's relevant, I think that's much more powerful. I think if I put myself on the other side of the transaction, I'd say that if somebody comes and talks to me about a different topic every couple of months, I probably would find it more difficult to engage. Whereas I think some of our best customers, I mean, are people that we've been talking to about sustainability and recycling for many years. So that's why I think that's why I think PR can really sort of give us the kind of value to have a consistent message that we can take and build on over a period of time that shows that we're really serious about the topic.
Yeah, and I would also add, absolutely, PR is long term. I think actually all of marketing is long term versus sales, which is short term. I think that actually, if you are serious about building a long-term proposition for your customers, and in all the businesses I've been in, which are really around financial services, it's always about having a long-term sustained investment in whatever you're doing. You've got to have a very strong, consistent, regular message that comes out of that, and it's PR that informs everything. Yeah. It's PR that supports the brand. It's PR that supports the marketing. It's the thing that provides all the evidence, all the information, all the data to actually back up everything that you're saying in your branding and your messaging and your marketing and your proposition. So it's very long term, but you've got to win the commitment, which is the second point about I wanted to make about internal education. You've got to get the commitment from stakeholders in the organization that these are our messages and this is what we're going to stick to. And there's not going to be any wavering from that. Sure, market conditions might change, strategies might pivot a little bit, but the bare bones of the claim that we're making as an organization are not changing. Because if you do that, then actually you undermine all your efforts. And that's obviously a very dangerous place to be. And you lose credibility and you're starting again, basically.
I agree with everything you've said.
Yeah.
And I look at some of the best political campaigns in the US, again, given where I've come from. President Obama, yes, we can. What do you remember about his campaign? Yes, we can. Why do we remember that? He repeated it, repeated it, repeated it, repeated it. And so when I look at quarterly planning and the focus that we're going to have, to your point, what are the key things that we want to be sticking to? We don't need to be wavering. Maybe we'll tell the story a little bit different way, but the point always comes back to the main point. And otherwise, we're going to lose people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think our internal education is really important to people, to this effort, because a lot of people outside of PR and marketing have a different understanding of what those functions are and what they can do and what they can achieve and what they can deliver. Mm-hmm. And that's probably the hardest thing, is saying, no, we can't do that, but yes, we can do this. And I think that I feel for my colleagues in our industry, because I've been in those meetings where, you're given an angry glare by the person that you're speaking to, because you're basically telling them that they don't actually understand what you do. and you run the risk of them thinking that you're hopeless. But it is what it is, right?
That's an really interesting point. It comes back to Caroline's definition of PR. Justin, you're kind of not a PR person, I suppose, and so maybe as the representative here of not PR people, do you think that's kind of something that is a challenge? This perhaps this expectation that public relations people and the public relations function can maybe solve problems that they can't, and sometimes there's a misperception in terms of what they can do?
I mean, I think in our context, if nothing else, PR is usually the people that we call when we do have a problem. So I think PR can definitely solve problems, but it's the kind of problems that we don't really want to have. I think our experience with all this is really that we need to give PR people the right sort of material to work on, and we also, I think, we need to define a good objective for the. I think we also need to define very clear objectives as well, because I've also seen examples where it's almost a case of, well, you know, we need to get a message out there, so PR, you go sort it out. So I don't think that's quite the way to do it, and I think the best PR that we've done, I mean, in fact, we recently did one with Caroline and Hoffman, was that we were pretty clear about not wanting to just talk about anything to do with coffee. We were very clear that we want to target people in offices who are looking for a certain solution, and and then we came up with, and I think Hoffman came up with the idea around future of work, and also gave us an execution that is quite different to what we usually do, and it was definitely helping us solve a problem that we knew we have, but in a way that we probably weren't expecting. So yeah, but I think if I sort of look back to why we sort of got to that point, was because we were very clear about what we didn't want, and we were also very clear about what the objectives were. So look, I actually think PR can help us solve business problems, but we just need to know what the problem is.
Caroline, do you find there is, from a B2B perspective, there is a problem in terms of sometimes in terms of how public relations is being perceived, and in terms of what it's being asked to do, and perhaps even what it's not being asked to do?
Yes, I mean, for sure, we see that confusing, and that's why I go back to, we have to define it first. So, in that respect, this is why, our approach going into a meeting with the client is, let's not talk about terminology, right? It's our job as the agency to find a solution. We don't have to call it PR. We don't necessarily have to call it marketing or whatnot. It's more about understanding, to Justin's point, well, what are you facing? What do you not want to do? What is the current business goal? And let us, bring ideas to the table. And I think, that approach really is an easier way for kind of aligning everybody internally, and not be stuck on the terminology aspect, and take away from the broader discussion of what is it that we want, what is it, the problem that we're seeing, and whatnot. So if I give you an example here, during the pandemic, right, we really saw that there was added pressure to companies, especially in the B2B and tech industry. We're seeing like shrinking of budgets, scrutiny, internal scrutiny from our client side. We're seeing change in terms of the pace of digital transformation, and then at the same time we're seeing how in-house comms or in-house marketing folks being actually held accountable for tangible results. And so, instead of, again, not going that route of trying to define everything, it was just more of us coming in and sitting at the table and understanding what are the needs of people like Justin, what are the needs of people like Marty and like Sheel, and let's together as a team, come up with a solution. Also, I mean, to that point, right, again, we're just using the term PR again. But right now in this day and age and this timing, especially during the pandemic, pure PR doesn't really, it no longer just works, right? And I'm assuming the definition of pure PR being only a media relations, public relations kind of play. Because if you look at it, and Arun, you and I know this, the number of journalists are shrinking right now. The number of media organizations are shrinking right now, right? So that means companies really need to find a way to reach their audiences directly sometimes, right? I'm not saying that PR is not important. Of course, it's the bread and butter. It is the core of this, but we need to find other ways working with our clients. And so, we're seeing in the last 2 years, I would say, that B2B technology brands, B2B brands really need to start behaving like consumer brands in order of how they go direct to market. And you saw that, some of that come across with what Justin was saying. And also we were seeing that, companies were really being thrown into the limelight there. They're not used to limelight, B2B and tech brands kind of like to kind of stay behind the limelight and kind of, let's be low key here. But, clearly in the last 2 years, given the pandemic, it was not possible. There was no hiding from it. And they kind of had to find a way to step up and to kind of own the rate narrative and be accountable, be in partnership with their sales functions and product functions and C-level suites. So that was, what was very interesting to me. And I think we'll continue down that road as we move into kind of hopefully the post-pandemic phase.
So let's not have a big discussion about the definition of PR, because then we will be here forever. But actually, your response and all of these responses provide quite a neat segue to one of the other questions I wanted to ask. So if we talk about media relations, which I think is a really valid point, and shrinking journalists and perhaps declining importance, but we can discuss that. So I suppose the question is, are you seeing changes in terms of how you spend your money, your investment patterns, looking at areas like media relations and thought leadership, which kind of the classics B2B comms, versus newer options, and I say newer in inverted commas because some of these things have been around for a long time, but areas like social media, owned content, LinkedIn as a platform, social good, influencer marketing. And I'm curious to hear from you all on how you're seeing that shift, if at all. And Marty, maybe I can come to you first.
In my role, I sit in the public relations function, but we are tightly integrated with the other functions, social media, marketing, all of them. So everything works together. And earlier I spoke about participating in discussions about strategy. So when we walk away from the table, we have to have collaborated in a way that ensures everything will work together. The exact mix may depend on the country we're talking about, or even the Singapore, maybe we're dealing with just Singapore or just Sydney. So those are considerations we have to take into account as well. The other thing that we're looking at increasingly, haven't done a lot of it yet, but is paid content. And Carolyn may talk more about that, as part of her knowledge with all of the different clients she's working with. But I'm starting to look at this for some of the countries across Asia Pacific and Japan.
And I'm curious, is that a response when you say paid content? Sometimes I hear that's a response to the media themselves starting to charge more for access to their platforms, or is it more like actual, paying to boost your presence on somewhere like LinkedIn or on digital platforms?
In the role that I'm in, it would be paying to place content, a byline or something in a platform where we may not have an opportunity to do so.
Yeah.
Or to Caroline's point, in a market where the media pool has become so small, maybe there's not an opportunity for an earned discussion.
Yeah, interesting. Sheel, over to you next. How are you seeing the changes in investment and focus, perhaps? Yeah,
in terms of investment, I think it really depends what market you're in. And for social media, it depends what channel you're talking about. So if this conversation is just about B2B, if I think about just about the B2B businesses, I actually, although it's a shrinking media pool out there, I think investment in media relationships are pretty key. I think investment in owned content and thought leadership is pretty important. And I think social media channels like LinkedIn is also, those would be my top 3 investments. Like investing in media relationships, making sure you've got a good PR organization, investing in owned content, and investing in social media. I mean, LinkedIn is so important now for lead generation for B2B. And actually, you know, by the way, they're among the most expensive social media channels out there as well for that reason, because they've become so important. Because the targeting that you can do on LinkedIn for the customers that you're trying to get to is pretty precise now. They've really nailed it. But LinkedIn on its own is not enough. You actually also need to make sure you've got a good investment in good content creation, because that's got to underpin any kind of B2B marketing strategy. So, you know, full-time dedicated team that's purely focused on creating, extending, amplifying education, knowledge, insights is so important. I don't think you can stress that enough. You create the content, and then you push it through channels like LinkedIn, that is how I've seen our investments change dramatically. You know, before it used to be, you know, well, let's make sure that we've got a good PR team. I think that's still important, as I said, but I think it's having your own content, because I think to Marty's point, sometimes you can't control the message, right? Obviously in earned media, you definitely can't control the message, but you've got so much that you want to say, and there's so much that actually people want to hear that's relevant. And to the point about cutting through the noise, through your own content, your own content creation team, you can then deliver the message that you want to the people that you want to receive it. And I think that's probably the most fundamental shift. And I think LinkedIn is critical. One more thing I would say, just on this point about investment, is influencers. Influencers very much was seen as sort of a B2C type of thing, but actually it's becoming more and more B2B as well. I think a respected columnist, an important media personality, they're people that you can increasingly cultivate to support your brand and influence corporate decisions. You know, particularly in crypto, you're seeing a number of really highly influential influencers who are respected and listened to. And by cultivating those kind of relationships, they can actually support you. It's much more subtle, but it can be very, very impactful.
Yeah, I can imagine. And it's interesting because the sort of areas you have outlined and the way investment is changing, that changes the nature of public relations teams and functions as well, right? In some cases, you know, maybe they shrink, or maybe it's different skills come in. So that's an interesting angle too. Justin, over to you. Where are you seeing changes in terms of how you spend your communications dollars?
I think we would actually like to spend more on PR, but for our business context, what we do need to do is we need to have the components there for our PR to be effective. So again, a lot of our business is very B2C driven. So I think in that side of our business, we really understand what to do and how to make it work. But I think for B2B, as I mentioned at the beginning, for a very long time, I think we were really coffee-led. So it was really just about getting our target consumers to taste the coffee. And a lot of the messages that we were trying to build were not sufficiently focused on some of our B2B customers. I mean, we have things that we have content, we have material that were relevant to particular verticals, but they're not really topics that I feel are PR worthy, especially in our market context. So I think really for us, I think we spent the last 2 years, and it's a very unusual 2 years, really trying to understand how we can become more relevant to our B2B customers. So we've done a few things with our hospitality customers. We've redoubled our focus around fine dining and also fine hospitality. And we're also trying to do more with the offices, starting with what we did recently around future of work. So I would like to spend more on PR, but I think the challenge here is that I need to have the building blocks ready. And I would say that in the next couple of years, what we'll be looking to do is to continue to find these building blocks that are relevant to the market. So, for example, we're in Hong Kong. I mean, most of you guys are not in Hong Kong, but I can tell you that we have the most restrictive border entrance policy in the world, probably. And with what it means is that our hospitality and the restaurant sector probably hasn't recovered to the extent that a lot of the markets around APAC is experiencing. So we know that there will be work that needs to be done, and I think we're certainly looking at what we can do there to try to build up our B2B capabilities so that when the market recovery comes through, we'll have a more compelling story to tell. I think for office, we know the future of work is something that that is relevant and topical to our customer, but we also need to sort of look at our offering. So can we provide a more flexible commercial model? Can we provide products that are more relevant to the local market? And can we wrap all of that around this topic of future of work so that when we do spend on PR, we're amplifying a message that is going to resonate. So that, I think, is what we're looking at. I think it's not really about not wanting to spend on PR. I would say that compared to the alternatives, PR actually is not the most expensive, and I think the likelihood of getting reach and consideration, I think it's certainly better than doing an event at a 5-star hotel. But we really need to have the right things in order for whatever to be spent on PR to provide a successful outcome.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's interesting because you kind of are looking at it in terms of themes rather than tactics, which is kind of it's a interesting angle and gives it a different spin. Caroline, from your perspective, looking across your clients, do you see any particular patterns in terms of how spend is changing?
Well, I mean, all I can say here is I think our approach is different, right? So spend definitely is changing depending on which department, marketing, PR, sales, even we work with HR departments, right? So of course there's going to be a change, but how we like to look at it here is really, again, very business problem solving approach, because if you know your budget, you can then plan an effective program to solve the business problems. So that's how I like to look at it, how we look at it. And, you know, all the elements that we talked about, whether it's PR, marketing, whether it's, you know, earned, paid, owned, even the influencers, LinkedIn, whatnot, it's just all part of the same kind of integrated comms toolbox as I look at it. And so then rather than just moving or removing investment from one area, it's looking at what is the total budget, and then how as an agency we could ensure that we can pivot to different formats, to different channels, back and forth, depending on the business goal and depending on kind of which teams we're working with. And so that's kind of how I look at it. And I know that's not a direct answer to your question per se, Arun, but, you know, I think it really, in the end, it is the effectiveness, right? That works for everybody, whether it's a Marty or a Justin or a Sheel. And so I kind of would like to focus on that, I guess.
Well, I'll ask another question then. Maybe any cautionary advice to B2B marketers who are perhaps you know, very dazzled by the prospect of LinkedIn and of working with influencers? I mean, have you seen anything that you know, do you think perhaps it's becoming almost too fashionable?
I mean, there's always fashionable channels, right? And I agree with what Sheel and what some of the others have said. Definitely, you know, for B2B and tech, we've seen a spike in leveraging LinkedIn. So whether it's on the kind of a company, you know, like Nespresso or a Nutanix kind of page, also on the level of kind of the executives, you know, representing the company. But, you know, one thing I'll add there is for sure, it needs to be more, I hate to use the word authentic, but it needs to be holistic, right? It's not just about, you know, sharing the brand, the company narrative. It's also you as a Caroline, as a Justin, you know, what does this mean to you as an individual, as a person? And I think we definitely see an increase in use there. I think, you know, for some of the consumer tech brands, maybe I think not surprisingly, you know, video related platforms. So whether it's a TikTok, whether it's a Snap, you know, for younger audiences versus a YouTube, or even most recently YouTube Shorts, you know, those are kind of formats that have been increasing even in the B2B tech field.
Yeah, I've noticed B2B companies on TikTok. So that's interesting. Any of you have got your companies onto TikTok yet? No, I guess.
You can't do it because it's not available in Hong Kong.
Banned in Hong Kong, I know, I know too well. My daughter complains about that every day. So one of the things we talk about spend, of course, it's really hard to talk about spend without talking about results, right? And you know, where the money goes is often where you can prove it works. So perhaps the next question for all of you is to look at that and to look at how, you know, obviously we see a rise in data, the data that's available to all of us. And so I wanted to ask what changes you're seeing in terms of how you use data and your ability to prove return on investment, perhaps bearing in mind what you'd already said about how spend is shifting, and also whether the rise of communications technologies and MarTech is changing that whole equation, because that's something we're certainly seeing, is this idea that you can now be more efficient with your spend because you can, you know, you can prove its effectiveness perhaps more easily, although I'm not always sure that's the case. So I don't know who wants to take that one first. I'll throw that one open.
I'll take it.
Okay.
I think about this quite a lot, and it's the biggest challenge for all PR, I think, and it has been for years. How do you measure this stuff and the return? I think the good thing is that there is now a lot more data than there was just even 5 years ago, right? Or even 2 years ago. There's a lot more data out there. And that means you can start to build a narrative around impact and performance from PR. And if you have good long run data that you can refer to going back, you know, last year, last 18 months, 24 months, you begin to be able to tell a story about how your PR efforts are performing. There is data. I do think that there are some dubious measures offered, dubious ways of measuring the effectiveness of PR that's offered by different companies. I saw one agency offer a metric related to reach. It gave a message of how many people potentially read an article. So it's not
OTS, I think, opportunity to see.
Yeah, right. And I mean, I think that's, you said you welcome controversial comments, and I think it's laughable, right? You know, so in the UK, where I'm from, you would say that the sun has 1 million circulation. That means 1 million people buy the sun every day, but 4 million people read it, because in the average household, 3 or 4 people will read the same publication. And then the claim is that because your media article appeared in the Sun, 4 million people read it that day, right? Of all the articles that were available for them to read. So yeah, I just think it becomes you've got to be quite careful around data. But I think it's a lot better. The way that I solve this problem is that at the end of the day, I think your ROI from your PR needs to be measured not just in terms of that standalone piece or that particular campaign, but also how you amplify it through paid media, because paid media is much more easy to measure. I think that you know, having a good piece of, you know, independent third party or independent research on your subject, which endorses your product or your claim or your service, that you can then amplify and measure the performance of, I think is, and track the performance of, I think is a far more convincing way of demonstrating ROI than looking at some of the kind of, you know, as you said, Arun, OTS and other measures that are bandied about, which are really, I think, you know, don't stand up to much scrutiny when you're really having a discussion about, should I put my marketing dollar here or here, and you're trying to make choices about that.
That's very interesting. So you you measure the paid amplification of
Correct.
perhaps
Yeah, I think that's what you do. I mean, obviously, not every piece of PR is available for, is going to be appropriate for that, but oftentimes there is. I mean, you produce some research, and then people write about your research. You can then amplify that yourself, and that's why I was saying in the previous question, investing in owned content, investing in people who create content for you in-house, and actually do it in a pragmatic and an independent way, I think is a really important investment to make.
Yeah, good point. Marty, over to you. How do you see the whole measurement debate?
Well, I think we use data to take a look at the publications we need to be in, the platforms our end users are looking at, the messages that are resonating with them. It's that simple, I think, and that data can guide the type of content that's developed. The publications you're speaking to, where you're placing content, if you're amplifying it and paying to do that, as we've just heard, essentially it helps guide your strategy.
Are you seeing any particular changes in terms of how you adopt, commstech or martech to measure effectiveness, or is that not something that you're that involved in yet?
I'm not personally, although the company would be, but again, to Carolyn's point earlier, as we're working with set budgets and things, we need to be as wise as we can about what we're doing, and the data helps guide us.
Yeah, it's a good point, Justin. I mean, from your perspective, how do you prove the value of the money that your company is spending on public relations, and are you happy with the measures that you have in place?
I think for B2B, the ultimate measure really is the kind of sales that it generates. The trick is really the time horizon that you're looking at. So with the most recent campaign that we did, I think our short-term KPI is really around lead generation. So that is something that we can easily measure, and we also have a timeline around. Well, we also have a target around sales, but that is really something that is based on our typical sales cycle. So we're both looking at the dollar amount, and we're also looking at what it does to our sales cycle. And we know that especially with the solutions that we sell, the sales cycle tends to be measured in months, and sometimes you have to wait for people to renovate before you can put a new coffee machine in. So I would say that it's not something where we're really looking at immediate results other than lead generation. And I think a lot of this we really need to look at least 3-6 months out before we can see what the outcomes are going to be. But having said that, that's the nature of the game for B2B, we feel, because again, with consumer programs, you can really easily measure results and you get a much more sophisticated KPIs. But I think if you try to adapt that model to B2B, I think you're really missing the point, because none of this is really about sales conversion. Because if we're talking about that, then that's a very different conversation, and we wouldn't be talking about PR.
Wow. Okay. That's a good answer, but it will come as it will be a bit of a shock for the PR industry, I think, to be told they're missing the point. But I think you make a really good argument as to why they are. So thank you for that. Carolyn, I asked the question about measurement, and I kind of got 3 different answers. So I'm curious, from your perspective, how do you manage that kind of a challenge? Because it's kind of an everyday challenge for you.
Yeah. So I mean, a couple of thoughts here. I think we've gone through different reiterations. I'm happy to report, in the early days, clients were looking at kind of AVEs, so advertising value equivalency. Thank God that's no longer in the picture. I know for many of us, on the comm side, it drove us crazy because we did not feel like it was an effective way to measure. What, to your point and comment about, the rise of commstech, we are seeing this, right? I think a lot of agencies across the board have to have some sort of solution here. So we definitely also have a solution whereby, we can look at share of voice on these tech platforms that we subscribe and use. So whether it's on social, whether it's across different media, there is data to analyze and to help us support future campaigns and initiatives. Another side is if we're looking at integrated, I think it's pretty obvious. You have statistics from Google Analytics, different dashboard that we can, look at and pull together for that. But I think I'm going to bring up a last point here, which might be controversial for other agencies. Where we stand, is really looking at business-related, business-based outcomes to guide us in terms of ROI. I mean, it's easy to look at, the PR aspect of it, but really, I think to ask our clients to invest more money, you need to show that you can make a business impact. And so, often these days, I will just give an example. We're working with a lot of companies around, hiring people. Given the great resignation, I don't really like that terminology, but given that change, we're focused on a lot of recruitment and employer branding campaigns. And doing so, apart from, the media hits, the analytics on the digital aspects, we're also looking at, well, how many resumes do we need to drive for the client? And we're looking at what is that conversion rate for our clients. So say you need 1,000 resumes in order to be able to convert, 500 into real hires, then those are some of the numbers that we actually are working on alongside our clients, just to kind of tag on to that ROI. And that has helped to move the conversations around, how much more to invest. It's been more transparent in terms of how much am I putting in? How much is it impacting the brand? How much is it really impacting my current business problem, which is I need to hire people across several markets. And so it might be controversial for agencies, but that's kind of how we're approaching it now, because it's a different state of play.
I think actually the point about content and indeed PR as a tool for recruitment is something that sometimes people overlook, particularly when you are focusing your PR effort perhaps on trade publications and industry publications as opposed to mainstream media, because the people who are reading those types of publications are actually not your customers. They tend to be your competitors, and they tend to be the talent pool that you want to recruit from. So, internally people love trade publications because they all read it, but actually, from a customer acquisition point of view, it's less useful. But from a potential employment and recruitment point of view, it's actually very valuable. And I think actually PR plays a role in that sometimes people don't always appreciate.
Yeah, it's a really good point. The employee aspect, and in fact, it's, as Caroline has pointed out, it's kind of relatively straightforward to measure. I feel the challenges actually arise when you're trying to measure more difficult metrics, maybe around reputation, maybe around longer term sales and so on. Marty, what is it specifically that you're looking at from a measurement perspective? What kind of data are you looking for, and how do you kind of find it?
Yeah, so again, to Carolyn's point about share of voice, that's something we look at, and we do use a platform that enables us to look at it at a global and regional and country level. And so to my point about data earlier, that's what we look at, and that helps us guide our decisions.
Okay. Yeah. So that's a, I suppose, a fairly straightforward way as well of kind of measuring spend, but it's I imagine quite helpful. Do you ever think that you want to look at other areas other than share of voice? Or do you feel like this gives you a clear enough picture of effectiveness?
Well, at the, you know, as I said earlier, I'm mostly responsible for external communications, and we do integrate with social and analyst relations and, you know, other things that the company's doing. And but for the function that I'm in, that's the one that I look at most closely.
Hey, Arun, can I add to that? I think, you know, if we just look at the share of voice aspect, right? A lot of our clients, apart from the sentiment, right? Is it positive? Does it mention the client's name? Does it mention the client's products? You know, things like that. We also have clients where they look at, well, is the product or client name, is that in the headlines, right? Is that within the first paragraph? Increasingly, it's a visual world now. Is there a video or infographic or even, you know, a photo that is, you know, that appears in that coverage? I think, you know, it's increasingly harder, right? Because there's a lot of things we can measure by. I think gone are the old days where it just appears, hey, it needs to be positive, you know? So not even all, that dive into a little bit.
Not all share of voice is equal.
Yes.
Well, and that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we've come to the end of an hour, so I think we've actually covered a lot of ground. I think we've had a really interesting conversation, and given me certainly a lot to write about when we cover this. So I think on the basis that no one has anything else they want to add or anything pressing they'd like to contribute, we can close the discussion. And I thank you, Caroline.
One more thing. Oh, Sheel, please go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say it's been fascinating. I would really interested to hear all these insights and opinions. You know, I think it's great when you hear people from different industries, and it's quite comforting to hear that everyone has the same challenges, no matter what industry they're in. So, I just wanted to say thanks. I think it's been really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
I just had a last point, Arun, just coming from me, is that, you know, the rise of content or B2B content, PR, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't equate into quality content. And I think that's something we need to look at in the B2B industry, in the sense that the material is still very jargon heavy. Yeah. And, you know, so, you know, how can we kind of cut through that, and how can we reach out to the audience in human terms? Because B2B and tech companies have a tendency to kind of, you know, go the other way, you know, and not speaking layman's language. And I think that's rather important. Yeah. Also, I don't know if others will agree on the call here, but, you know, I think people are just tired, you know, given the last couple of years, that, you know, there needs to be less spin in the world. They're just fatigued out by all of that noise out there. And I think, again, you know, to my part about jargon, it is about being straightforward, and it's about being, you know, upfront and being able to admit it when things are going wrong. You know, it's okay to be authentic. I know we don't like that word, but for lack of a better term, right? And honestly, where I'm seeing from the, you know, just all of our clients, they vary on that scale. And, you know, they haven't really reached that stage compared to, you know, the consumer brands, if that makes sense. So I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really good. I think both of those points have kind of sort of been in the background as we've discussed, you know, the challenges in terms of just the noise of B2B content, and how so much of it does seem to be focused on jargon and features rather than, as you said, a kind of human approach, and that extends to giving companies, I think, a human face. But I do think that's changed a bit in the pandemic, right? You see CEOs at home, there's that has definitely improved. But I think that's a really good note on which to close. Does anyone have anything specific they wanted to say in response to those points from Caroline?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo echo the point that Caroline has said, because I think especially in B2B, because of what we do, we see both B2B and B2C. And I think in the B2B world, the kind of messaging that we see is usually more about what the vendor wants to say rather than what the customer might want to hear. That is a lot. I mean, it happens in every industry, but I find that in B2B is a lot more than in B2C.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a lot more about how we can change the world for you, but you don't really know what world we're in. And I think authenticity in B2B is hard, because I think authenticity, I mean, for us, our product is we sell coffee to consumers and we sell coffee to corporate customers. So when you have essentially the same product but delivered in a different way, it is probably a little bit easier for us to stay consistent. But I can see that in other industries where your product offering for the B2B world and the B2C world can be drastically different, I find that what works as authentic in B2C may not actually work in the B2B world. So I think we're quite lucky in that I don't have a solution for that, but I just think that that's something that I certainly watch out for, because I also don't want to make sure that how we communicate in B2B don't deviate too much to what we do in the consumer world.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, it's about tapping into local conversations and talking about how we're solving problems for customers.
Yes, back to basics.
Back to basics.
It's knowledge, Arun, as well, right?
Yeah.
People thirst for information and for knowledge, and your customers or your potential customers in the B2B space, they don't want to know what it costs. Much less, they want to know much more. They want to know, what does it mean, and how does it fit, and tell me something I don't know. And then you do that, then the conversation becomes much more deeper than just a transactional one. And that I think is the key to Justin's point. Not the vendor trying to tell the customer that it can change the world. Yeah. I think it's actually about the vendor telling the customer something the customer doesn't know, that the customer's looking to find out more information about. And particularly in my space, which is very new, cryptocurrency, digital assets, people are very, very curious. And you give them information, help them with education, teach them something, not in a hectoring way, but in a sort of informative, collaborative way. They become very, very loyal to you.
Great, thank you all. Some really, really useful and helpful advice there from all of you, from all of our experts indeed in this discussion. So thank you all so much for your time. I really enjoyed it. I hope you did too. And
thank you.
Do it again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.